One of the first comic books I was ever introduced to was Avengers number 165, and it's the second part of a three-part story arc that features Count Nefaria as the villain against the Avengers. This would be my first introduction to Earth's mightiest heroes, and what an introduction it would be. The 1970s were a great decade for the Avengers. Early on, you had some very memorable stories written by Roy Thomas with the Kree-Skrull War, drawn by Neal Adams, and then followed up with a very memorable 3-issue run drawn by Windsor Smith. Now, these were some heady times for the Avengers, and if you started here, you'd be hooked for sure. There are certainly some other outstanding issues worth checking out, including the Avengers Defenders War in issues number 116 to 118. But what prevented the Avengers from getting to the next level, like, say, the X-Men, was the consistency in the run. You can make an argument that some of the story arcs are just as good as the ones in the X-Men, but there were a lot of issues that, were maybe average at best. I'm going to talk about one of the peaks of the Avengers in the 1970s, and that's the run by Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter started writing full-time on the Avengers with issue number 158, and this was around 1977, and he was 26 at that time, which, it's pretty impressive, but what's even more remarkable was that at this time, he already had 12 plus years of writing experience in comic books. Jim Shooter actually started writing comic book strips when he was 13 years old, and he actually sold some when he was 14 to DC Comics. He would become the full-time writer for Legion of Superheroes at 14 years old. Now, I don't know about you, but at that age when I was 13, I could barely put two proper sentences together. Number 164 starts with the mysterious figure of Count Nefaria, who is recruiting some supervillains to conduct an experiment that would secretly siphon their powers, but temporarily boost them. They are the Lethal Legion, and they are Power Man, Whirlwind, and the Living Laser. He employs them to gather the resources needed to bring this experiment together. So the Lethal Legion become part of Count Nefaria's nefarious plans, and he succeeds in the experiment. You may know Count Nefaria from his villainous ways from the X-Men. He was the villain of note in issues number 94 and 95. But he actually appeared in the Avengers, early in the Silver Age with issue number 12. But at that time, he was more like, an ambitious gangster. I have to say, Count Nefaria and covers just don't seem to mix. A lot of comic book fans are familiar with X-Men 94, and it's the first issue in the run featuring the new X-Men. And it gets bashed a bit for the composition, with a jet and the X-Men coming out of his nose. Avengers number 165, I think, is even worse. Here you have his ghost head toppling a building on top of the Avengers. The cover just does not do justice to the comic book itself. Now, I had this issue early in my comic book reading days, and I can't even remember how I got it, but I read it to death, and probably coverless. And, actually, I don't know where it went. I think I took it camping one year and it just kind of disappeared. But to me, this was a great introduction to a lot of superheroes and the Avengers. These issues were written by Jim Shooter and penciled by John Byrne, who is just entering his peak as well. Byrne's artwork is just top-notch, and I wondered, what would have happened if he actually stayed with the Avengers during this time instead of jumping to the X-Men. It's not to say the Avengers didn't also have other great pencilers, because George Perez was also a regular penciler for the series starting in the 140s. Back to Count Nefaria. He gains the amplified powers of Power Man, Whirlwind, and the Living Laser, and he just pummels the Avengers. He absolutely crushes them. He just tosses away Captain America's shield and almost decapitates Black Panther. I hadn't read many comic books at this point, and I just didn't know or expect heroes to get beaten, and beaten so badly. Nefaria even beats on senior citizens as he almost chokes out the Wizard, a superhero from the golden age of Marvel Comics. Issue number 165 also has something very rare in comic books, and that is the reverse cliffhanger. Now, what does a reverse cliffhanger mean? It's just a term that I just kind of made up, but let me explain. Typically, at the end of an issue, you have a hero or heroes in a perilously dangerous situation, like in the preceding issue of the Avengers. However, at the end of this issue, we have something different. It's the reverse. We have Thor show up, pretty upset at what's going on, and unleashing Mjolnir on Nefaria. Now that is one heck of a panel. Can you think of another comic book that has this kind of cliffhanger where the hero is actually about to lay the beats on a supervillain? It's just, you don't see it very often. This issue drove me crazy for several years. When I originally read this, I was, maybe 11 or 12 years old. And it would be years before I would be able to read number 166. All those years of waiting and waiting to find out what happened, and amazingly, when I did, I was not disappointed. First, the cover. The cover is so much better than the previous 2 issues. This issue also featured an amazing slugfest featuring everyone, including the Vision, who's brought out of a coma and engages Nefaria. I want to comment on Jim Shooter's scripting here. It's just amazing. There are just some lines I thought that were great. His wordsmithing in the Avengers is just something else. If you like sharp dialogue, lots of action, superheroes and supervillains engaging each other, then this 3-issue story arc is for you. How does Jim Shooter follow up with this? Well, it would be an amazing cosmic epic called the Korvac Saga. This long story arc features most of the Avengers ever to appear in the series, along with the Guardians of the Galaxy, who come from the future in search of Korvac, who had escaped them from the 31st century. There are a lot of moving parts in this series. A lot of flashbacks, or flash forwards, featuring a dizzying number of characters. And there are a few I want to talk about, and let's start with Korvac. He's by no means your typical supervillain. He's pretty much a living computer, originally from the 31st century, and when he travels back in time, he locks in on a power source, which ends up being the homeworld of Galactus. And there he's able to tap into and gain immense amounts of power. This newfound power also clears his head, and his ambitions change, and they are to bring order to the chaos he sees in the universe as a benevolent ruler. As he's originally a human, he sets base on Earth. The next character I want to talk about is Starhawk from the Guardians of the Galaxy, and his special ability, or one of his special abilities, is to kind of detect and find Korvac. They fight early in the series, and while Starhawk is really powerful, he is no match, and Korvac actually destroys him. He literally disintegrates Starhawk. But in order not to arouse any more trouble or suspicion, he restores Starhawk, wipes out his recent memory, and removes the ability of Starhawk to perceive him. This would be important later in the run. And for me, Jim Shooter creates a very original twist that I thought was brilliant. Another character that's important to this series is the Collector, and he's one of the elders of the universe, and although his appearance suggests he's a feeble man, he's a force to be reckoned with as he wields the power cosmic. As his name suggests, he collects. But he collects with a purpose, and that's to collect beings of power to combat this upcoming threat that he senses. He's one of the first to sense the threat of Korvac, and so he goes on a collection spree, and also sends his only daughter to spy on Korvac. This issue is important to me because it relates to the first comic book I was ever given, and that's Contest of Champions number 1. In Contest of Champions number 1, there's a flashback to this particular issue where the Collector is slain, so I was always curious about this issue. For this time, this was a pretty heavy read and some of Jim Shooter's best work. There are a lot of interesting questions raised, and this lengthy story arc also has an unbelievably spectacular finish. I want to bring up Starhawk again at this point. Korvac's wiping of Starhawk's ability to perceive him would come back to backfire on him, as the Avengers find Korvac, but find this very unassuming man. They keep talking to him, which really bothers Starhawk because what he sees is nothing. They are talking to somebody who isn't there. The others start to realize what is going on and realize this man, Michael, is actually Korvac. I'm not going to spoil anything else because if you haven't read this, there is such an amazing spectacular end to this story. But wait, there's even more. I think one way to measure the success of a story arc or event is to see if they follow it up with a what-if story. There are a lot of good what-if stories that are based on alternative endings to very popular story arcs. You had this with Apparent Deaths, like Phoenix and Elektra. And they also did one with an alternative ending to the Korvac Saga. And it was titled, What If the Avengers Had Become Pawns of Korvac? To me, this single issue is also memorable because it showed me something I had never seen before, which is the meeting of several of Marvel's most powerful cosmic entities. Take a look at this awesome 2-page spread that shows a meeting of the cosmic powers to discuss the problem of Korvac. James Starlin would take this up another notch with Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet, but I wonder if he got his inspiration from this issue. I thought, wow, this is really cool seeing all these extremely powerful entities together. There are quite a few memorable panels in this issue, including one where Captain America faces off against Galactus with the ultimate nullifier. The writer Mark Gruenwald does an astonishingly good job of summarizing the Korvac Saga as well too in the first 4 or 5 pages of this issue. This issue is just jam-packed, and I mean really jam-packed, and it's one of those what-if issues where the story comprises the entire double-sized issue. Mike Gruenwald does a nice job of tying loose ends up as well in the story, like having Korvac seal the universe off from interdimensional threats, as well as banishing some of the other real powerful beings on Earth, who are Doctor Strange, the Phoenix, and the Silver Surfer. And like a gift that keeps on giving, what happens to these 3 characters is explained in another issue of What If. That is What If number 41, which also has a fun story about Conan, and a memorable fight between Conan and Captain America. Yeah, but I'm getting off topic. The story featuring the 3, Doctor Strange, Phoenix, and Silver Surfer, is a nice short story that really does a good job of tidying up the end of that story. So you have the original Korvac Saga, and then an alternative ending in What If, and then another story in What If tying up a loose end in the previous What If issue. Like, what an epic story. If I have one remark about this series is that, it could have been done in fewer issues. I think the original Cosmic Epic was spread out in around 11 issues or so, but it certainly feels like it could have been condensed down to 5 or 6 issues, as there were some extra stories that were kind of mixed in between the overarching story arc. As well, I felt like the afterword, was kind of weak, but, it's hard to blame. Like, how do you jump in after this amazing, story by Jim Shooter? Like, it's impossible to kind of jump in after this, I think. To me, this is Jim Shooter's magnum opus at Marvel. Not Secret Wars, although Secret Wars has certainly some nostalgic value. This story is just him at his peak. This is also one of the high points of the 1970s in Marvel for me, so I really hope you have the opportunity to read it if you haven't read it before. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can check out another one of my episodes over here. Until next time, enjoy and read your comic books.